For this next session of the Future of the American Child journalism training, I'm sure many of you in the room are aware of the recent news about the state takeover of schools in Houston, Texas. It's part of a pattern over the past few decades of having this type of seizure, if you will, be the solution to underperforming schools where test scores are low, resources are low, and there don't seem to be on the surface solutions to turning that situation around. Well, research has been able to uncover a pretty stark reality that a state taking over a school system isn't necessarily the answer, and that there are some underlying themes and issues related to this kind of practice that journalists need to be aware of when they're reporting on education writ large, but also on the mechanics of a school takeover. And since many of you are from large urban cities where this might happen, we think that this is an important briefing for you to have. So today we're joined by Professor Domingo Morel of the NYU Wagner School. Professor Morel, good morning.
Good morning.
In my prep calls with you, I was fascinated first by the depth of your research and the depth of your insights into what this means for many children in this country. So I'm really looking forward to having you unpack this issue for us and help us understand what we need to know. So please take it away.
Thank you so much, Rachel. This is it's an honor to be with you all today. So I've been presenting on state takeovers for several years now, and would like to think that this is probably the most important audience for this presentation. So I've been studying state takeovers now for roughly 10 years, and in every situation where I, begin to study a particular district, community, the journalists are the most important source of information for me, and obviously for the communities that experience state takeovers. And so, over the time that I've studied this, and which, although I've been studying it for roughly 10 years, I've been looking at data on state takeovers and community experiences with takeovers for over 30 years. State takeovers started to emerge in the late 1980s. And I can see that over time, the coverage of state takeovers in school districts have become more critical as more information has become available, and journalists have been a critical, important part of that. So what I'm going to do now is just share my screen so you can see with me my presentation here. So yeah, this is just the cover of my book, Takeover: Race, Education, and American Democracy, which I published with Oxford University Press in 2018. So first, I think it's important to share, just the kind of like the basics of what state takeovers are. So a takeover is when the state legislature, the state board of education, or the federal courts charges the State Department of Education or another designated entity, such as a mayor, with managing a school district. The first state takeover of a local school district was in 1989, the Jersey City schools in New Jersey. Since then, there have been over 100 state takeovers of local schools. I think we're about 110 at this point in 22 states across the country. And as Rachel just mentioned, Houston being the most recent school district and one of the largest state takeovers of school district in the history of the United States. So those are the basics. When I started to do this research, naturally, people are concerned with this question about when states actually take over a school district, does it improve educational outcomes? In other words, do we see graduation rates increase? Do we see math and test scores increase and college attendance rates increase, right? And so just to be clear, the evidence on this, and particularly the most recent evidence on the effects of state takeovers on educational outcomes is just not good at all. the schools in school takeovers in general do not improve educational outcomes. We had some case study work going back years to suggest this, but now we have more robust evidence to show that over time and over school districts, these interventions do not really work. And work, by meaning work, I'm saying here, we just don't have strong evidence that they improve educational outcomes like test scores, graduation rates, and so forth. So the question then is, why do state takeovers persist? Why do states still engage in these types of interventions? And so as a political scientist, I'm coming to this research from a perspective of politics. And I think that politics helps us explain what is really happening and can lead to further questions, particularly as journalists, that can be asked on the ground from local officials, from state officials, and others. So one of the first things that sticks out, right, particularly from a political perspective, is looking at the places that have experienced state takeovers of local school districts. So these are only selected cities here, but as you can see, these are major cities, and obviously Houston is added to this, should be added to this list now. These are major American cities. You know, Cleveland, where you are today, experienced a takeover in the early 2000s as well. But you know, from kind of like a civil rights perspective, the racial politics perspective, these cities also pop out as spaces of contested political debates and political struggles over time. And so not only are they, these places being experienced takeovers, but these takeovers are mostly happening in majority communities of color and specifically majority African American communities. And so what we see here is just a map of where these takeovers are happening and what percentage of the overall Black student population in these states are are in districts that were either are currently under state control or are under state control at some point. And so you see in some of these places, we just significant amount of students, Black students, are in districts, are attending school districts that are either under state control or were under state control at some time. And so these data are a little bit outdated as of this point. The numbers are certainly larger, and particularly when we take into account Texas, where the largest school district in the state was just taken over, and so we can see that we can anticipate that the number of Black students in the state of Texas under state control is going to increase, right? So one other thing I think to keep in mind is what types of takeovers can states put in place, right? And so generally there are three types of takeovers as it relates to school boards. So in one case, the state can take over the school district and leave the elected school board in place, right? That's one possibility. In another possibility, the state can take over the school district, abolish the locally elected school board, and replace the school board with an appointed board. And then finally, there's a third option, which is the state takes over, abolishes the locally elected school board, and doesn't replace it at all. And I think this is pretty striking to see in terms of racial dynamics, what happens in majority Black districts, majority white districts, and majority Latino districts that experience state takeovers. So although majority white districts are less likely to experience a state takeover, they do. So there are several majority white districts across the country that have experienced a takeover. But as you can see here, in 70% of cases, so the blue here represents where following a takeover, the school board remains in place, elected. The orange represents where the state abolishes the school board and replaces it with a new appointed board. And then the gray represents the times when the state takes over, abolishes a local school board, and does not replace it at all. There's no school board, right? And so again, going back to the majority white school districts that do experience takeover, they get to keep the elected school board in place in 70% of cases. In majority Latino school districts, they get to keep their school boards in about 45% of cases, and then 55% is appointed. But For majority Black school districts, they only get to keep their elected school boards in place, or slightly over 20%. And the rest is abolished, right? So over 70% of the school districts are abolished, and over 30% of them are not replaced at all. So we're talking about a majority Black communities, state takeovers occurring. They lose their elected school boards, and over 30% of cases they don't even get a school board at all, right? And so this begins to complicate the picture, I think, about how the effects of takeovers on communities of color, particularly Black communities. And so so what I'll do here today is kind of just present, my research approach to understanding state takeovers of local school districts, provide some background on, the information that I gathered through case study and through particularly of one city, Newark, which I'll talk about some more in a second, and some data collection and analysis that I did regarding state takeovers, right? And so my primary question is, so why takeover in the first place? Right? Particularly with growing evidence that takeovers do not improve educational outcomes. And why do state takeovers disproportionately affect the Black communities? Additionally, why do Black communities disproportionately experience the most punitive forms of a state takeover? And by punitive here, I'm talking about, again, losing their elected school boards. Right? There's another kind of puzzling dynamic here as well, which is, in order for a state to take over a local school district, they first need to have a law that allows for that to happen. And so as of 2015, we see here that it's really Republican governors at the helm of, pushing for the passage of state takeover laws. Right? So it's dominated by Republican governors and Republican state legislators as well. And so why, this leads to a puzzle for me, right? So why would Republican state officials take the lead proposing state takeover laws and initiating state takeovers of local school districts when the ideological and conservative principles would suggest an approach that favors local control rather than state centralization? So we do know that part of conservative ideology is this idea of local control, not having, state and federal intervention come into localities, right? This respect for local control, and so it's puzzling that it's the conservative Republican Party that is taking the lead in passing these laws and actually taking over school districts. So, in order to try to understand the emergence of state takeovers, what are the factors that may be associated with state takeovers, I do a case study of Newark. And so I was, I taught in Newark, Rutgers University in Newark for 8 years, but, prior to arriving for 7 years, I should say, prior to arriving to Newark to teach at Rutgers University, I was doing research, as a PhD student on the Newark experience with the state takeover. So the Newark schools were taken over back in 1995, and I'm not from Newark, although I'm from a city, Union City, not too far from Newark. And so I just was trying to learn as much as I could about Newark's experience with a state takeover. And of course, the first place that I went to is what did the journalists have to say about the experience with takeover, the years leading up to the state takeover of the Newark public schools. So I was reading the Star-Ledger, Philadelphia Inquirer, New York Times, and other news outlets, in addition to reports that the state of New Jersey had produced. And there was a consensus narrative around the state takeover of the Newark public schools back in the early 1990s. And that was a picture of a school district and a community that was not able to provide an adequate education to the children of Newark. And as a result, state intervention was necessary to improve the schools and to improve the conditions. That was the consensus that I gathered from the newspaper sources, the state reports sources, and others, right? But what I saw in Newark when I arrived to Newark to study the Newark schools, I saw something very different, right? I saw a community. So here is an image of a Newark public school meeting in 2013, which was when I was studying the Newark schools, right? And so I saw something very different. I saw a community that was very engaged with the schools. I saw a community, particularly young people, fighting for improved educational experiences, right? Students fighting for their teachers, walking out in protest, right? And so in conversation with the students, with community organizations, with local elected officials, with parents, teachers, and others, I saw a very different picture about what was happening in Newark. And in my view, it was a community that for a very long time, based on my conversations with people who have been involved in education struggles there for decades, it was a community that was serious about its education, a community that had been fighting for more adequate resources, curriculum that reflected the community and so forth. And so it was at odds, what I was observing, particularly at the school board meetings, was at odds with the narrative that was portrayed about the Newark public schools. And so and the Newark community in particular. And so that led me to try to understand the historical aspects of education in Newark. And one of the things that really emerged was this critical period in the 1960s in Newark, right? And so here, this is an image of the rebellion, what Newarkers call a rebellion, others call, riots in 1967, which was a pivotal period in the history of the city. So by the mid 1960s, Black Newarkers represented the majority of the city and had no political power. Didn't have political power at the school board level, at the city council level, mayoral level, any level of government. And there was frustration with the Black community, within the Black community, about their lack of political power and what they thought was an oppressive, white power structure in the city that did not allow them to be able to, have meaningful employment, to move around the city and other factors. And this one situation came up in 1967 where a school board seat became available. And at the time, the school board was appointed by the mayor. And although African Americans represented the majority of the city population in Newark and they had no representation at the school board level, the Black community expected that this vacancy would be appointed, the mayor would appoint an African American school board member. And, there were the demands. School board meetings looked a lot like, the image I showed you of the school board meetings in 2013 filled. And what turned out was that the mayor did not appoint a Black member on the school board, appointed a white member on the school board. And the community was upset and said that if we do not get, this is quoted in one of the archive material that I was reading, that if we do not get Black representation on the school board, we will have blood in the streets of Newark. And this was in 1967, in the early parts of 1967. And by April 1967, exactly what happened, right? Newark had this rebellion, one of the largest uprisings in the history of the United States. Over 23 people were killed, right? And what the governor who commissioned a report to study the factors that led to this uprising in Newark, what they found is that the schools were a critical part to understanding what was happening there, right? So the report attributed the controversial school board appointment as one of the factors that helped the state help set the stage for the July riot. In addition to referencing lack of representation on the school board as key factor, report cited also the state of educational crisis in the Newark public schools. So the dropout rate at this time, the report was published in 1968, but the data that was used was from 1967. The dropout rate was at 32%. There were dilapidated buildings and shortage of teaching personnel. By the mid-1960s, the Newark public schools did not have the physical space to educate every Newark student. And so the educational conditions in the city of Newark in the 1960s, by the late 1960s, were dismal. And what the community was doing is trying to fight for more representation and more resources to get the educational system where they thought it should have been for their students, particularly for the Black community, for their Black students, right? And so over time, this actually starts to happen. By the early 1970s, they have representation on the school board, the city council, and eventually have the first a Black mayor in the city in the history of the city. In addition to this representation, communities in Newark and in other cities in New Jersey, like Jersey City, start to demand more resources for their schools and actually start to win court cases to get more resources for their schools. And so what we see here is New Jersey state funding for public education between 1969 and 1996. We see how there's a sharp increase in a steady, I should say, increase in dollars for public education over time. This didn't happen accidentally. It wasn't because the state decided that they were going to increase state funding for public schools. It's because the communities demanded this. And through the court system, actually, were able to win lawsuits for these to get more resources for the schools. So by the 1980s, we start to see an increase. And for the first time in the state's history, these majority Black communities are poised to get resources to improve their schools in ways that they never had before, right? But what are the politics of this? What winds up happening? Well, there's tensions between cities and the suburbs who saw that the or thought that the funding that was going to go to the school districts based on these urban school districts based on increasing taxes for the suburbs, it just created tension. So here we have to the left, Newark superintendent at the time, Eugene Campbell, who said, following all of these, court case victories, which were going to lead to increased resources for the district, said 28 districts will be receiving a significant increase in funds. The children of New Jersey stand to benefit by this change in funding to school districts in need, right? So this is what the superintendent in Newark is saying. On the other hand, you had John Dorsey, who's the Republican Senate Minority Leader from Morris, one of the wealthier districts in New Jersey, stating that the new funding formula required working class people in middle class communities who drive around in Fords to buy Mercedes for people in the poorer cities because they don't have cars. And so this tension that starts to emerge, and one could call resentment between the suburbs and cities based on questions of funding, really start to change the landscape around education in particular education politics in the state of New Jersey. So that's what's happening in New Jersey, and I'll come back to that in a second now. And what I wanted to see was, do we see similar dynamics play out across the country to help us understand takeovers and the question of funding across and tensions between cities and states? And we do see that we see similar dynamics happening across the country. And so here is total public education expenditures, dollars and billions, across time in the United States. So we see from the 1970s, relatively stable education dollars spending around $180 billion, and then it starts to increase in the 1980s, very similar to the way that we saw happen in the state of New Jersey. And then one can argue, well, maybe part of the reason why this increase in funding, we see this increase in funding is because we have more students. But actually, that's not the case. So here the blue represents the funding, again, in billions of dollars, and the orange represents the public school enrollment in millions. And we see that public school enrollment over time has remained relatively steady. But what we do see increase is public school dollars for public schools, right? And this is in 1987, the percent of state's fiscal year budget. We see that the largest percent of state budgets are dedicated to elementary and secondary education by the 1980s. And so this is important to note because as increased funding for education, as funding for education increases across states, we start to see the politics really change around this, right? And again, it's not simply that states decided that they were going to provide more funding for schools, is that there were political dynamics that led to the demands for more resources through the court systems, and courts deciding that it is true that the way that we fund public education is unequal, and that students that come from communities that are low resource, in order to have equal education, need more resources, and those resources need to be coming from the state, right? And so in response to that, what we see is, this rise of the, so-called education governors. So by the 1980s, governors assumed greater authority over local schools. And at the 1986 annual meeting of the National Governors Association, the governors announced a plan that would be part of a second wave of reform in American public education and introduced the policy of state takeovers of districts that failed to meet toughened minimum standards. And so, if we're looking at just 1986, we do see that school districts are struggling. But when we take the historical perspective and we see, again, using Newark as a case study for what we see happen across cities across the country, we see that these communities have been engaged in a political battle to improve the schools for decades. And it is precisely at this time in the mid 1980s where they actually starting to get the resources to improve the schools, right? But it's at the same time that they're starting to get the resources that states start to pass laws that allow them to take over school districts, right? So again, these are majority Republican administrations that are pushing for the state takeover of local schools. They're happening in communities that are majority communities of color, particularly majority Black communities, which by this period of time, beginning in the 1960s, really start to be an important part of the Democratic coalition, right? And so we have not only race politics to take into account, but partisan politics to take into account as well. And in addition to this, right, it was not just New Jersey where we see the connection between funding and state takeover laws. So here what we have is school funding plaintiff victories between 1980 and 2000. In other words, these are times when plaintiffs were filing lawsuits to get more resources for their schools and actually winning. And what we see is that between this period of time, there are 18 states where plaintiffs actually won court victories to secure more resources. And in 14 out of those 18 states passed laws to take over school districts. And if you see the 4 states where it did not happen, Montana, North Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming, I don't know, we don't need to be, statisticians to realize the demographic realities of these cities. These are states, I should say. These are 4 of the whitest states in the country, and they happen to be the only ones where state takeover laws were not passed, right? So we have the racial dynamics to this, we have the partisan dynamic to this, and we have the funding dynamics to this, right? And so I wanted to then test what are the factors that may be associated with the likelihood of a takeover. We have many school districts across this country. We have over 10,000 school districts across this country, but only, roughly 110 or so actually experience takeovers. So what are some of the factors that are associated with takeovers? So if it's just education, then we would see a lot more takeovers of public schools, right? Because there are a lot of school districts that are struggling. And so I wanted to try to test what are the factors that may be leading to the likelihood of a takeover. And so I collected original data of takeovers between 1991 and 2006. These are the data sources that I rely on, and I run some logistic regression to try to understand, the factors that may be associated with this. I won't spend a lot of time on this part, but these are the independent variables that I'm looking at. I'm really trying to understand, does Black political empowerment or Latino political empowerment affect in any way the likelihood of a takeover? And then I have all of these other control variables in the model, including Black, Latino, and white population, the city, and the population at the district level. And then I have several variables in there also to take into account for revenue that's coming either from a local source, the state source, or federal. And then finally, I include in the model the percent of students in the district that receive free lunch as a way to test for poverty. And so we do know that increases in poverty are associated with lower academic performance across districts. So this is a way to try to test for how poverty may affect the likelihood of a takeover. And the strongest indicator or I should say predictor, of a state takeover of a local school district is not necessarily poverty or what we may consider to be low educational performance, underperformance of schools. It's actually the percent of Black city council members that the city has. So if a city has 0 Black city council members, the likelihood of a takeover is less than 5%. By the time that we have majority African American membership on the city council, or in some cases 100% Black membership on city council, like many of these majority Black cities, that likelihood of a takeover increases to over 10%, around 15%, right? So this is the strongest predictor of a state takeover of a local school district, Black political empowerment in these cities. So what are some of the implications of this, right? So states began to take over school districts precisely at a moment when school districts were beginning to get the resources that communities demanded. The emergence of state takeovers in the 1980s and 1990s represents a shift from the idea of the undeserving Black student, an idea systemically challenged in the 1950s and 1960s, to a focus on the undeserving stewards of the education of Black children, their parents, their community leaders, the elected officials, and so forth. And the political collision between state governments and urban communities that created the conditions for a takeover are incapable of producing the collaborative environment that is necessary for sustainable school improvement. So we do know that from the highest performing school districts across the country, there is a healthy system of collaboration between key stakeholders, right? The parents, the teachers, the school board, the superintendent, the local elected officials, and others. And that state takeovers create tension and hostility that makes that essentially impossible. And the systematic political disempowerment of Black communities through state takeover of local school districts show how education is central to the project of state-sanctioned political inequality, in my view. So that's it for my presentation. I look forward to taking questions and talking some more.
Domingo, I had a quick question for you before I open it up to the journalists. And
Yes.
that is, in so many of our discussions around the issues underpinning child welfare, child well-being, we're often advised to not rely on that single story. In other words, not necessarily say that race is the driving factor, or that we should only be concerned about Black children or only concerned about poor children, that the problems are spread equally. But the more I hear about this particular topic, it seems that race and lack of resources are just, you just cannot exclude them. You cannot say that, it's the same for everybody. Is that a correct characterization, or do we need to sort of put that in a broader context too?
Well, so thank you for that question. I think the research is pretty clear on this, that race is at the forefront and that it needs to be part of our critical analysis, our questioning, right? This is not a policy that is affecting white communities, although there are many, many white communities that have many struggles, particularly on questions of education, right? It's a policy that is targeted specifically at, up to this time, mostly African-American communities, but now increasingly Latino communities as well, right? And so I think from the perspective of understanding state takeovers as an intervention, I think that we can't say, race and lack of resources are not at the forefront. There are other things that we need to be considering. While that might be true and some other levels of policy making and factors, I think in this particular case, the evidence is pretty clear that race needs to be central to our understanding of what's happening.
So when we think about, again, the major urban centers that this is happening, are there any that are on the radar screen that you think they may be the next domino to fall in this regard?
Yeah. So I have to say, probably over the last 5 years, I actually thought that state takeovers of local school districts would start to decrease. And in fact, that we're starting to see some of these districts that have been under state control for a very long period of time, like Newark, for instance, was under state control for over 20 years. The city of Philadelphia has been under state control for many years as well, had been under state control for many years. And so the transition from state control to now local control, we're starting to see it happen. And so I thought that state takeovers might actually be in the decline. However, and I think this is important to know about state takeovers in general, not just focused on education, right? So education becomes the place where takeovers start to emerge, and it's the most visible and where we see it most often. But we're starting to see takeovers beyond education, right? So we start in Jackson, Mississippi, for instance. The state of Mississippi is trying to take over policing functioning in Jackson. In Missouri, the state is trying to take policing responsibility from the city of St. Louis. And obviously, I'm sure we all know about Flint, Michigan, the water crisis that was because of a state takeover of management of the city in Flint, right? In Georgia, following the election, the last presidential election, the state passes law to allow the state takeover of local elections in Georgia, right, which has significant implications for Fulton County and Atlanta, right? And so that takeovers now, while I thought that they may be on the decline, we're starting to see them weaponized in ways that it just makes it very clear that it's not just about the stated aim of, like, let's say, improving education or improving policing or improving elections, right? That there are these other factors that are associated with these interventions that essentially they're being weaponized in a way to really, openly harm communities. And because of that, I have to believe that, we're going to see, as the tensions continue to rise between Republican state officials, governors, and state legislators, right? And these cities, which are fighting for more progressive, solutions to their problems, we're going to see these tensions continue to emerge, to rise. And so my sense is that we're probably going to see takeovers occur. Now, is there continue to occur? Is there a particular city or cities that stand out to me at this point? I can't. There's not a particular city that I can think of right now that is, potentially targeted. But I do think that where there are significant, like, big cities with in states with Republican-led governors and state legislatures, that we're likely to see this policy pick up.
Anna, did you have a question?
Yes, my name is Anna Spurry. I'm with the Kansas City Star. And actually, the Kansas City Police Department has, for a very long time, been under state control. But you answered most of my question just now, actually. I'm curious if the narrative you're seeing from these Republican governors in the states where there are state-controlled schools, has that narrative changed much from back in the 80s and the 90s?
Actually, they haven't, right? So it's really interesting. The narrative hasn't changed much. The narrative is still, there's an underperforming school district. There is mismanagement at some level at the, local, whether it's a local school board or local officials, right? Corruption questions, just an inability to produce, the outcomes that are necessary to improve schools. This is still the logic. This is still the argument, rationale that we see. Now we have more evidence to show that, maybe we need to be questioning this some more. And in fact, I think the Houston case is kind of like a blatant example of this, right? So Houston is 8th largest school district in the country, over 200,000 students, over 200 schools, 12,000 teachers, right? And the state of Texas actually has given the Houston public schools a B average. And the rationale for taking over the school is basically on one underperforming school district which has over time improved and right now has a C average given by the state. I don't think anyone is in Houston or in the state of Texas, anywhere, saying that the Houston public schools are not in need of support and improvement. I don't think anyone could say that. You know, I've been talking to organizers on the ground and teachers on the ground in Houston. I don't think anyone can say that. However, to take over an entire school district, to get rid of the locally elected school board, and then the policies that are likely to come as a result of this takeover because of one school in a district with over 200 schools, just, you know, begs questions about what's really happening here. This rationale that was provided in the 1980s and is still being provided now just needs to be put under, you know, significant critical analysis.
Erin?
Hi, Professor Morel. Thank you so much for just sharing your data and your case study with us and all the research you're doing. I'm a freelance journalist based in Chicago, and I'm also a school board member in suburban Chicago. And so I have two questions for you. So in the last 2 years, our school board has gone from all white in a community that is 40% students of color to I was the first woman of color elected to our school board, and now we have 2, and we have 3 people of color. A little bit different ideologies, but we're still reflecting the student demographic now on the school board, which is encouraging. My question around that is, you know, you talked about majority Black city council members, or when in the city council there begins to be more Black representation, being a big indicator, right, of a potential state school takeover when there's a Republican administration in the state. What happens in communities like ours? I mean, ours, being in Illinois, it's a little bit different right now for us politically, but communities that have more and more multiracial political power, both on the school board level and the village council level, have you seen that same kind of tension is a little bit different? And then my second question is, when there is a state takeover of a school board, such as in Houston, or a school district, I should say, what recourse does the local community have, the school board, the superintendent? Is there anything they can do so that it's not a situation in Newark where it becomes a 20-year, 20-year just, you know, back and forth and state of tension?
Yeah, a great question. So I'll handle I'll take the answer the second question and then go back to the first question, which is really, well, both questions are interesting, but the tensions part, there's a lot to unpack there. So in terms of what can communities do when they're either threatened with a takeover or actually experience a takeover, right? So my research shows, so I've looked at districts that have obviously experienced a takeover, but districts who've experienced a threat of a takeover and were never taken over as well, right? And so there's one example in Union City, New Jersey, where they were threatened at the same time that Jersey City and Newark were threatened to be taken over. They were threatened as well, and they didn't. And now actually the state of the Union City School District is one of the kind of, is a model school district for a largely immigrant population, right? And so, you know, in some work that I've done, I've argued that part of the reason why is because they were never taken over, but they got the resources, you know, to improve the schools, right? So, and they got the resources because the communities were fighting for more resources. So they got the resources without the takeover, which in my view led to the possibility to improve the schools. But, you know, back to the question, I think there has to be organized resistance from the teachers, from the students, from the parents, from the community organizations, and from the locally elected officials to continue to fight for the return up to local control. And even under state control, there are ways that people can try to influence policy. And so in the case of Newark, for instance, the school board didn't have political power, but the school board became a vehicle for the resistance in so many ways, right? So that they would, at the time of the school board meeting, that they had the actual platform to allow community members to come and speak. They would use this time because they didn't have policy-making powers, right? But they would use this time to highlight the concerns that the community had and provide essentially a platform for that. So that's one way that the school board can be part of trying to produce change, right? And then also there are decisions that are happening today, small and large decisions at the school level with the principals, with the teachers, and with the people in the schools, right? That may in some ways not be affected by the state takeover. And so what I encourage parents and to students and others to do is to find the ways that they can influence policies that may be in some way shielded from the hostility of state intervention, right? So those are some ways that I think, I've seen communities try to fight back against this and try to create community in a situation of hostility, right? So then to your other question about racial, ethnic differences and perhaps tensions. So actually, I began my research on state takeovers looking at a majority Latino community, which led to like the puzzles that I eventually studied in research questions that I eventually studied, right? So I looked at this city called Central Falls in Rhode Island, which was a majority Latino school district. They were taken over in the early 1990s, and at the time they had a majority white school board. And when the state took over the schools in the early 1990s, they abolished the majority white school board, although the student population was majority Hispanic or Latino at the time. But they took over the majority white school board and appointed a new school board. And for the first time in the city's history, they had Latino representation on the school board as a result of the takeover, right? And so this, to me, the first city that I was looking at Central Falls, was kind of puzzling that here was what seemed to be an opening for a community to increase its political empowerment and, through this intervention that seems to be undemocratic. It seems to be something that communities don't want, right? And so what I eventually wound up hypothesizing was that, state takeovers are, as a political instrument about political power affects communities differently. If you have political power, then the state coming in to take over is going to have a negative effect because you lose your members on the school board, you lose the ability to influence school decisions and other economic decisions at the city level, right? And so if you do have political power, it is detrimental. But if you do not have political power, then a takeover is not harmful to you politically because you did not have political power in the first place. And it actually can create the certain types of disruptions that may lead to increased political power for these communities that are marginalized in these cities, right? And so my data actually shows that communities that have high levels of political power at the time of a takeover actually decrease in political power measured in school board representation and the ability to influence school politics. And those who are marginalized actually increase their representation following the takeover. So it does create opportunities for these marginalized communities. However, after continuing to study takeovers over time, what winds up happening is that those communities that were once marginalized and may have seen increased representation on the school board as a result of a newly appointed board, that those communities over time also feel equally marginalized because the state was not invested in their well-being. And in fact, what I argue is that the state was essentially creating and exposing cleavages within communities to then be able to insert their policies into these communities by neutralizing a potential opposition, right? And so, I'm saying a lot there, and it might be, more confusing than helpful, but essentially, I think that there is a very important aspect of multiracial, multi-ethnic politics that states can exploit to move forward an agenda. And so what I argue in my work is that these communities really need to organize collectively to then determine what is the best path as dealing with state takeovers, right? Do they want to invite state intervention versus fight off state intervention? That it needs to be collectively determined rather than the state determining it for them.
Thank you.
I hope that answered your question.
You actually just wrapped both questions into one answer at the very end. So I feel a sense of closure. Thank you.
Thank you.
You may have said this, and so forgive me if I missed it, but Are there any states where Democratic governors oversaw a takeover?
There have, and particularly in the earlier years, right? And so this is really important. I think it's related to the question that I can't remember. I'm sorry, the one from the Kansas City Star, the journalist from the Kansas City Star was gonna say about partisan politics here, and I think it may be related to this. So in the 1980s and 1990s, the Democratic Party, and particularly at the state level and the national level, looked very much like the Republican Party in terms of education issues, right? And so, the Bill Clintons of the world, right, governor from Arkansas, and even Obama emerges, as kind of like a reform-minded Democrat. And so the Democratic Party had very much had similar views, at least at the governorship, to Republicans in many ways. What we see over time is the changing politics, that communities, particularly in cities, are not happy with these types of reforms. And we see it in Newark, right? So the emergence of Ras Baraka as the mayor in Newark was in direct reaction to state intervention. We see what's happening in Philadelphia now. We see what's happening in Chicago, right? These are cities who are electing leaders, all of them Democratic leaders, of course, who are against this idea of reform in the ways that Democrats and Republicans both endorsed and supported in the 1980s and 1990s. And so as a result of that, we see a very different politics start to emerge with Republican versus Democratic governors. That those Democratic governors really have to pay attention to the city constituents who are telling them this is not the approach that we want. And so we see that divide, that polarization on the approach of education reform look very different now between Republican governors and Democratic governors.
Well, our last question, there's another, Jennifer.
Yeah, just a quick question. This is Jen Brooklyn with the Detroit Free Press. I don't want to conflate inputs with outcomes, and so I just am curious, and you're overqualified to answer this question, but you showed that slide on public school spending going up, and I just didn't know whether public school spending is directly, invariably correlated with better test scores, better graduation rates, or do we sometimes not see increased public spending on public education translate into those educational gains?
Yeah, I mean, so the data is pretty clear that increasing resources helps education in many ways, right? We see increased resources help out in terms of testing, in terms of school climate, right? Supporting kind of things like social workers and these types of programs that are really supportive to students. So increased funding is associated with increased outcomes across all of these different levels. Now, there's variation in that, right? And there are many factors that can complicate that, right? But the overall takeaway is that increased resources does lead to increased outcomes across a number of measures.
So my last question to you is,
I noticed that there's another question in the back. I'm sorry, I saw somebody with a microphone.
Okay. All right, I'm sorry. I'm just okay.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Petrie.
This will be the last question from
Texas
before.
Public Radio. In Houston specifically, the county judge, which is the Texas equivalent of a county executive, is a charismatic Latina in her 20s. The mayor is a black they're both Democrats. And the state legislature has a real problem with both of those folks. Is there any sense that there's sort of a political retribution at play in this move to have a state take over of the Houston School District?
Yeah, I think, I've argued in a piece that I wrote about the Houston state takeover that clearly the tensions between the Republican state administration, governors and state legislatures, and these tensions in cities with our mostly people of color and mostly Democrats is what's contributing to the likelihood of a takeover happening, right? And in the case of Texas, it's particularly, I think, striking, right? So Texas, the majority of the population is a community of population of color, right? So either African American, Asian, Latino. Most of them, not all of them, of course, but most of them identify as Democrats. However, the state legislature is dominated by Republican administration. So what I argue in my work is that, what we see across cities and across states, across the country, is that the emergence of political power always begins at the school level. That first you have school board representation, and then from the school board representation, meaning African American, Asian, and Latinos here, right? You first have representation on the school board. From the school board, then you have representation on the city council level, the state legislative level, mayoral level, and then eventually Congress. And through that, you begin to create a political base for political power. And what I think is happening in Texas is that by taking over the school district, you're not just dealing with education politics in the ways that we're accustomed to thinking about education politics, but that has broader implications for state politics in Texas. So that you are undermining the largest city with the largest base of Black and Latino political power. Of course, San Antonio matters here as well, but Houston more so. That by undermining them, by taking away their schools and their ability to govern, then you set in motion this essentially the derailment of political power for these communities, right? And so I think that there's no question, in my view, based on the research and talking to people in Texas, that this is something that is happening there.
So what advice would you give to a reporter from Houston? We don't have one from Houston right now, but if you wanted to see a story that really added value or that helped the public understand the implications of this issue, what might that story look like?
Yeah, so I think that's a really great question, and I think that there are several things that we still are learning from the academic perspective about state takeovers. But I think that journalists are really positioned to help out the conversation in ways that scholars will be able to do in several years. You can do that now, right? So there's something said about, journalists are, they write the first draft of history. I think that is so accurate, and particularly in the case of takeovers, I think that there's so much that can be done there. So what I would like to see, would urge a journalist, particularly in the city of Houston and other cities experiencing takeovers, is to really critically examine the rationale for the takeover. And I think Houston provides us, this blatant example of how a school district, by all measures, particularly the state measure, is not failing. And so how is it that is going to, why is it that a state takeover is the solution when we know that takeovers do not lead to improved outcomes and the school district itself is not failing? So I think that there are many critical questions there that need to be asked, right? Beyond that, we know that increased resources lead to better outcomes. So I think that journalists really need to be asking the hard questions. If you take over the school district, and we know that resources are an important part of it, how is the state prepared to add resources, right? Because state takeovers are not associated with adding resources for schools, right? So asking questions for that. Asking questions about what is going to be for the teachers, right? So in the early years of state takeovers, teachers were actually not opposed to takeovers because they saw struggling school districts and thought that maybe the state intervening would actually be helpful. But then they learned that it's not really about that it's about actually undermining teachers' unions, firing teachers, right? So in New Orleans, right, following the state takeover of the New Orleans public schools, following the Hurricane Katrina, there were massive layoffs. New Orleans had the largest Black teaching force in the country. 75% of the teachers were Black. Within 10 years, it was under 50%, right? School closures, right? So these questions that are really important for communities, I think journalists need to be asking the state officials, particularly the commissioner and the governors who are really responsible for these policies. How are you going to help in these areas which we know are associated with healthy, robust, and high-performing schools, right? I think those are the questions I need to ask. And finally, something that we just don't have that I'm aware of, any evidence for this at all, any research on this, is how are takeovers leading to questions of mental health for the students. So we know, particularly because of the pandemic, there are many, many questions, concerns for student mental health and their communities, right? So how are state takeovers affecting this, right? And I think that journalists at the front line could be asking these questions about what are states planning to deal with this, right? Because we know that anybody who covers education knows the importance of social work presence and other counselors and, takeovers are not associated with the increase in that. They're associated with actually cutting these programs, right? So those are some of the things that I would urge journalists to really be thinking about, and as people on the front line, to help us think through what's really happening here.
Sort of boils down to the resource issue. So we are greatly privileged to have now access to you in terms of thinking about these stories and producing content related to this issue in the future. So I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for taking time out to join us this morning. Let's show him our gratitude.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we will definitely stay in touch with you. Take care.